Hello and welcome to session 252 in the ASSERTIONS reading group. Tonight we'll be discussing the first half of the article Propositions Concerning Digital Minds and Society by Nick Bostrom and Carl Schulman. This is a work done by the Future of Humanity Institute, where Nick Bostrom is the director and Carl Schulman is senior researcher. It's a paper that has recently been published as version 1.10, and there's been a draft circulating for several years. I think this is a thing that happens very much in the Future of Humanity Institute, that people send these drafts to each other and obtain a large number of comments. There's probably we probably don't see what they write until a couple of years after in many cases. And of course, we're only taking the first half today, and I would expect next session to be the second half. Nick Bostrom and Carl Schulman starts with a rather expressive disclaimer saying that this is very tentative work. They're not trying to make some very strong predictions about anything. They're just saying this is a thing, a consideration that you could think of without making like any claims of completeness or thoroughness or anything like that. And some of these more philosophical state propositions have been a bit tough for me to evaluate, in the sense that I don't have any formal philosophical training. And in many of these cases, they're talking about consciousness and moral value without really defining these concepts. And very often, to me, it doesn't matter that much precisely what definitions you are using. But in this particular case, I actually believe that the definitions might matter a lot, because when you're talking about things like consciousness, from a strategic point of view, where people want to maybe help the AIs and maybe feel compassion for the AIs, so we'll let them out of boxes and things like that. In this case, it matters very much what the people who are currently interacting with these AIs, do they believe that they can suffer, for instance? And the moral frameworks that they are using might be really, really interesting. And I expect that different moral frameworks will have very different answers to some of these questions that are being raised. Also, I should say that I expect that with AI safety, we are facing an imminent catastrophe on AI, and that makes thinking about whether AIs suffer and thinking about whether mind crime happens and all these things we'll talk about today a bit strange, in that there is another issue that is rather large, which is, will we all be killed tomorrow? And in that case, why should we care about the moral and not just care about the instrumental considerations? I think there is an answer to this, that we should in fact care about the moral consequences and the moral sides, because they very often, directly or indirectly, influence the instrumental factors. So I do believe that it is important, but I also think that the authors should have tried to distinguish these two things, because it is a very different thing, like how can we avoid getting killed, and how can we create the best long-term scenarios, etc., and all these things, avoiding suffering and things analogies to factory farming and what have you. The first part was the one I had the hardest time getting through, and that's consciousness and metaphysics. This is a meme I found on the internet from the authors, stating that there is in fact no difference between artificial neurons and biological neurons. And this is formalized, this is not from the paper, of course, this is formalized as the substrate independence thesis, that you can have mental states on many kinds of physical substrates. What matters is the computational structures and processes, that's enough for consciousness, and not whether it's happening inside a cranium or something like that. And this is asserted to be true. So the Chinese room argument by Searle is not accepted by Nick Bostrom. I think I would probably agree with this, but I would care more about what do other people think. And I also kind of feel that this is somewhat weak, in the sense that the word mental states, like, does that mean quality or what? Like, mental states that can also be like purely functional, and in that case the substrate independence thesis is obviously true. In this case, the one of the consequences of this would be that an emulation of a human would be conscious, and we could also see AIs that are not emulations of humans but doing other things that are in fact conscious. And so the obvious question for me is, why do we care about whether they're conscious? We care more about whether they can kill us. Well, if they are conscious, they probably have intrinsic moral worth of some kind, and that might matter very much to us. When talking about consciousness, the naive way of thinking about consciousness is like, either you have it or you don't. But the authors Nick Bostrom and Carl Schumann thinks that the quantity and quality are matters of degrees. In quantity, obviously, you can have a number of copies, you can have repetitions, you can have them running for a longer time, both by having faster computation and just more wall clock time. You can have implementations that are more or less robust. You can have them more or less closer to humans in different way, how you measure that. And I would argue that might be less related to quantity and more related to quality, but that's really a nitpick. They also say that there is a greater quantity if it has a greater quantum amplitude. And I tried to look into what does that actually mean. I did spend 5 minutes on the internet trying to figure out what does it mean that these processes have a greater quantum amplitude, and I didn't really understand that. So I think they ought to describe that in more details, and I don't think it matters very much. I can see someone in the chat has already written something about that. Quality, that's also a matter of degree, in that, like, how aware are you of your consciousness? How self-aware are you? Is it like a good or a bad experience? That might also matter very much. And how strong are the desires, moods, and emotions and things like that. So I think that's the conscious experience is a very matter of a degree. I think that's a reasonably well established proposition. They make some more assertions about consciousness. If you have 2 runs of the same program, do you get twice as much conscious experience? Scott Alexander has written this answer to Job, which argues that in fact you don't get twice as much conscious experience from this. And the obvious perverse incentive instantiation is where you find the optimal conscious experience, and then you just have a computer run that single program again and again and again. And is that really something that is valuable to us? They have another statement here that I think is interesting. Significant degrees of consciousness require significant computation and complexity. Is that really obvious? I don't think the complexity might really be required. I could imagine an extremely simple AI that is basically the neurons that like perceptrons, or even something totally simple. And then you just have a lot of that, and if you have enough of them, then you get something that is conscious. I don't have a strong model about consciousness, so I can't definitely say that, but I think this extremely non-complex system would, in fact, could be conscious. And also, like, how much computation is required. I would imagine like an optimal Bayesian reasoner, like an AI designed by like optimal, whatever that would mean, according to the limits that we have found. An optimal reasoner might require even very little computation, like an update that is literally only doing Bayes reasoning just once, that requires like 1 flop or something like that, 3 flop I think for Bayes, applying Bayes rule. And I could see a system doing that which was in fact conscious. So I think I would reject this proposition. They have another proposition: many animals are more likely than not conscious, which is a very weak claim in my opinion. You could try to negate that, and that would be that that most animals are probably not conscious. I think that's a the way I would state this would be that probably most animals are conscious to some extent. I am very bullish on animals having some kind of sentience. And conscious and AI. Are present AIs to some degree conscious? Well, we had in the last session a long discussion about Lambda, where I came out as much more putting a much higher probability on Lambda in fact being conscious than most others, both others in the reading group and people in general. I think there is a substantial probability that Lambda is in fact conscious in a meaningful sense, and well, most people would consider it obvious that they are not, and Nick Bostrom at least puts some probability mass on this. But again, consciousness is difficult to define, and the way most people seem to define it is I know it when I see it, and in this case, obviously, current language models are strongly not conscious, but that's a very weak definition of consciousness, but one that may matter very much from an instrumental point of view, because people are not going to give Lambda any kind of rights or any kind of moral consideration right now, based on their theory of consciousness. And their theory of consciousness, most people don't have. Like if you ask the man on the street to explain global workspace theory, you won't get anything at all, right? So they define consciousness in a much more naive way, and from this, it's clear that current AIs are not considered conscious. Okay, how about if we emulate the brain? That's obviously something that could be conscious, and that's something, of course, also very different from Lambda and current AIs. I totally accept, of course, that they can be conscious. Though, does that constitute survival for an emulated human? I am not entirely sure I would accept that proposition. Like the obvious counterexample would be if I was non-destructively scanned and emulated somewhere and then killed. Would that count as me survival? Like I would strongly object to that. It's possible, and depending on your philosophical views, certainly it might be something that happens. Here again, they say teleportation need not be morally objectionable, and like I think I would probably consider that suicide, and suicide is something that you can object to. You can also say that this is something that people can choose, and people have the right to choose, but I at least have a right to object to suicide. The authors talk a bit more about what theories of consciousness and what they should explain and things like that. They end up discarding some of the classic theory of consciousness, because if you literally interpret them, then very, very simple systems could indeed be conscious. That's an example that I've previously in the reading group talked about, that if you some of these definitions of consciousness is like self-awareness, and it's obvious that my Windows computer is self-aware in the sense that it has a model of this PC and knows like what hardware is on and what's running in the kernel and all these things. So if you define consciousness in this simple literal way, then you run into this kind of problem. And of course, the answer to this is probably that the people using these definitions are not using them in the literal way, but when you're not using the definitions in the literal way, then you are having bad definitions, and precisely what you should do instead, how to interpret these. It's something that, like, it's probably because I don't have a strong philosophical background. If I had a stronger philosophical background, I would be more likely to understand what they mean instead of just reading what they literally write. Based on some of the criteria, integrated information theory, that's one of the things that fails. Global workspace theory is one that I have criticized earlier. I can't remember what my criticism was, but the authors are a bit more optimistic about that, and some other theories. Let's go to the next chapter, respecting AI interests. First, they talk about moral status without defining moral status. So I had to look on the internet and try to find what I consider to be the most widely used definitions of moral status. What does it mean to have moral status? And again, it's perfectly plausible that both that the authors, Nick Bostrom, mean something different, and it's possible that most people mean something different. And I would really like to be certain about these things, and I would like to know in particular if there's any difference. It might matter a lot if Nick Bostrom have some of the underlying ideas about things like moral status that differs from what most people think, because again, it matters what most people think. Right. Moral status. An entity has moral status if and only if its interests morally matter to some degree for the entity's own sake. So again, here I found a diagram where we have moral status if there's a good of its own, there's sentence, and moral agency. I'm not vouching for this being like the most common view, but I think it seems the most common just to me. Okay, so if an AI has a moral status, then we have a moral obligation to consider not harming, consider its welfare. But who are we in that sentence? It could be the AI developers, the researchers creating new technologies that might enable consciousness. It might also be the AI users, the people who instantiate the AIs, or it might be society in general. The view from Nick Bostrom's proposition is it falls on all three. I think it's a problematic thing, because I think it matters a lot, not just who has the moral obligation to consider their welfare, but who also needs to figure out if it is in fact if it has a moral status. And the way I probably think this works out in practice is we have a wonderful triangle of absolving responsibility, in that the AI developers, if you read some of the papers they write a lot about that when we actually use this technology, the people who use this technology need to take care that we don't use this for anything negatively. So AI developers, researchers in general, put the onus on the AI users. And if you ask the AI users, obviously they put the responsibility to society in general. Like, this is not something that that the user need to do to know about. This is something that should be laws and like ethics boards in society at large that handles this question. And what does society at large, would they point to if you ask them like who should consider if this AI has moral status? Well, society in general would point to the researchers. So we have a wonderful circle where everybody points to the other person, and no one in fact takes responsibility for this. As far as I can tell, no one is really taking responsibility for this. I think in general, Nick Bostrom makes a more general error here in assigning responsibility to three parties. And in particular, assigning responsibility to society in general is something that just basically never works, right? Eliezer Yudkowsky would argue that that's not how it's done in Das Elan, where responsibility is explicitly pointed to one particular person in all cases where this is at all possible. Okay, but let's actually dive into the moral status of AI. Why does it matter? Well, if we don't consider it, we could, before we've even considered the issue, suddenly we have something like factory farming, which can be the authors don't argue, but part of the problem is this kind of thing can be really sticky, in the sense that if we didn't have factory farming and someone said, hey, is it okay we keep chickens in like these conditions, then obviously people will say no, that's abhorrent. But if this is the way we've been keeping chickens for like forever, then people will say sure, that's how it's always been done. And it's quite possible that the way we treat AIs can be sticky in the same way. and of course is instrumental for other reasons. Like the argument before was on purely on the moral side, but it's also instrumental in that the people who care about this might not be the people we want to care about this. Like Blake Lemoine would be an example of someone who cares about this and is not necessarily thinking entirely rationally about and going entirely rational about it. And it only takes one person to let an AI out of the box, for instance. Okay, another proposition: what's good for an AI can be very different from what's good from a human being. On an object level, that obviously makes sense, right? And AI, we should be worried about anthropomorphizing, etc. But there is like a thing like preference utilitarianism. Like what we should do with the AI is treat it as it says it wants to be treated, right? So it's not certain that on the meta level there is actually any substantial challenge here. Then another issue that Nick Bostrom has previously written about: agents with stronger interests, super beneficiaries, and greater moral status, super patients. Is that something? That's certainly something that can happen. I can see it happen, and I can also see a substantial instrumental point in denying this. In that, if we want to reach some kind of agreement, modus vivendi, with AI, then accepting that AIs can be utility monsters is probably not going to fly at all. There's a strong selling point considering everyone to have the same level of patience, being the same kind of patience and not being super patients, and that's probably really instrumental to keep, possibly. And then they have another interesting, like, how do you actually treat copies of AIs? Do they have like responsibilities for what the previous version has done before? And the authors argue, yeah, actually, they do. They relate to their previous time segments just like humans do. I haven't seen that argument before, and I thought that was actually kind of cute. And I wonder if this can be quantified, and I think actually it can be quantified by parallel with humans, where like some crimes do in fact get too old and can no longer be prosecuted. I think can be quantified the rate of decay to some extent. I thought that was a cute argument. Okay, we talked before about treating the AI the way it wants to be treated. So obviously, consent seems like a way we could be more moral in our dealings with AI. And so, if it can give informed consent, it should be required, and if it can evaluate whether it has a good life, then they should approve of coming into existence. I think that those are good. I also think there's a very obvious loophole here in that you can just design the AI to not be able to give informed consent, and then it's not required. So we are really pushing the problem one level up. But it's a start certainly. Informed consent is not obviously reliable. There are ways to get around that. We should try to avoid miserable AIs, and I think that's of course morally a really good thing, but not obviously an instrumental thing. Designing an AI to have specific motivation, is that generally wrong? I don't know. It's an interesting question. It's been with humans. It's been evaluated in Adolf Huxley's Brave New World, where humans are in fact engineered to have motivations that are useful, and that seems like it's a dystopia, obviously, and so it's certainly plausible that people will say that this is in fact wrong. And a nice statement: we should, when we build AIs, and to the extent that we can control their preferences, we should try to have them compatible with ours. And that seems like a good instrumental thing, but it also requires that we have substantial control over the preferences of the AI, and that's like a substantial part of the alignment problem. And so, for this reason, there is a strong moral component to solving the alignment problem. So That's another good reason to solve the alignment problem, but we already have really good reasons to solve the alignment problem to avoid getting killed. Avoiding discrimination. Bostrom and Schulman presents two principles: substrate non-discrimination, that if two beings' intelligences are the same except that they have different substrate, then they have the same moral status. And on ontogeny non-discrimination, if they only differ in how they came into existence, like one was born and the other one was created, copied in some way, that also doesn't matter for the moral status. Sure, that sounds reasonable to me. And obviously that seems good in itself, and that also seems like something which could be used for as a basis for some kind of cooperation between humans and AI. Possibly. This is somewhat unclear to me. It's not something that I have thought a lot about, because this is something that kind of happens after the singularity, you could say. And they have an idea that if there are aliens that are artificial intelligences, or a future that is built on AI, they might see if we discriminate based on these two principles. They may assess us to have low moral worth, and that may be instrumentally bad for us. Sorry. I think in particular for the aliens, that's obviously instrumental, but whether the AI aliens would in fact see us as more worth saving because we care about our AIs, that seems like anthropomorphizing really quite a bit. I have a hard time seeing that really being relevant, but it's an interesting consideration. I hadn't thought about it. Contractarianism. I think that's Hobbes. Nick Bostrom has in contractarian views, AIs that have the potential to reach a position to greatly help or harm us beyond our control may have an elevated social moral status in a norm-determining hypothetical social contract. I think that's interesting in the sense that I am not a contractarian. I have a hard time emphasizing with this, in the sense that this seems totally obviously wrong, and like, just because the AI is able to kill us, that doesn't mean that it should. That just means that we should try not to build it and try to make it not want to kill us. And trying to negotiate in this way seems strange to me. But it's always nice to see people who are not utilitarian try to grapple with these things, because most of the moral and ethical considerations with regard to AI safety and transformative AI have been made by a consequentialist utilitarian. They, from the contractarian point of view, they have some considerations, like we should owe them compensations if we try to align them, put them in boxes, for instance, and if they help us a lot, then they are also owed some kind of compensation, especially if we can give them the compensation afterwards. So the idea is we put them in a box, ask them to solve the alignment problem, and then once they've solved the alignment problem, we have aligned superintelligences, we have resources, all the resources we would want, and so we can give them quite a lot. And particularly we can give them, and not the successor. So the AI that was forced to be in the box and develop an aligned AI somehow can then be preserved, and even though it's unaligned, we can still give it like its own galaxy if it wants to have that, because we can in fact have sufficient resources for that. Nick Bostrom is positive about this kind of thing. He even says, yeah, it's more promising. I am, of course, a lot less positive about this because I'm not a contractarian, and I think that the opportunity costs are very real here, in that if we try to bargain with some kind of AI, the way it will look like in practice is like we are totally crazy, and this kind of negotiating with an AI causally in this way has like we spend a lot of time on it, and we seem like we're totally crazy if we do that. And also, I don't expect this will work or be particularly ethical, because I'm not a contractarian. So I'm less optimistic about this approach, but I appreciate the novel perspective. Security and stability. In a transitional period, we will need special precautions for AIs who are misaligned. And I think that's obviously trivially true, but it also betrays an uncertainty in this work about to what extent is the alignment problem in fact solved. And both has problem been solved and has pivotal act been performed, because we don't know in particular whether I expect if we don't solve the alignment problem at all and we don't do any kind of pivotal act, then we lose everything and nothing we do matters, all value is lost, whatever, right? Whereas if we strongly solve the alignment problem to the extent that we can just get a perfectly aligned AI and just ask it maximize our coherent extrapolated volition or something like that, then the problem is also very small. This kind of considerations seem much more relevant in a middle case where we don't solve the alignment problem like perfectly mathematically, but we kind of do solve it somewhat, and we don't have a really strong pivotal act where we have some well-governed singleton that can just say, don't build misaligned AI. But we do build some misaligned AIs, but not enough that they are able to actually destroy all value. So it's kind of like in between, and I think the authors would have been well served by making much more explicit what kind of scenario they are envisioning along these two dimensions. Have the alignment problem been solved, and hasn't the pivotal act been performed? If we have AI again with which is not perfectly aligned and not perfectly controlled by a singleton or something like that, then we could see a large number of new risks going on. If we look back historically, there have been a lot of wars and a lot of expropriation events and revolution and things like that. And this might happen on digital timescales instead of happening on biological timescales, and that will mean that if you had like a house in the year 1000, and then the odds that you would still have that after in the year 2022 would be very low, in the sense that obviously in Denmark, like if you had invested in the stock market in Denmark in 1900, then that would have been really foolish, because in 1941 the Germans attacked and took everything, and so obviously you would have lost everything. And the United States is probably the only place in the world where I can see someone investing in the stock market in 1900 and having the money, in fact, in 2022. I think there's been expropriation events just about every United Kingdom, maybe. There might be a few other places, sure, but in general, if you want to have, if these kind of things happens like 100, 1,000 times more often, then we can't expect to have any kind of continuity. Robin Hansen's book Age of M has an entire age where a huge transformation, like comparable to like the Industrial Revolution, and the things happen when the humans who are outside looking at their clocks say that between 1 and 2 years have passed, and of course the de facto power in the on Earth have over this Age of M shifted totally to the emulations, and so if we need to keep our property and keep our existence through this, then we need some really stable protections, and probably we need them soon, before the AI start to have real security implications. So can we get really stable institutions? We might. We could have things like treaty bots, Like if you imagine you have two actors, maybe two AIs, maybe humans and AIs combined in some way, negotiating with each other, maybe on national levels or whatever. They could make treaty bots, and then you know, perhaps the weaker part, the less intelligent, builds it, and the more intelligent verifies it, and then the treaty bots check that they adhere to some kind of treaty. Is that in fact feasible? We obviously don't know. This is very speculative technology. I think that it might in fact be quite feasible, because if treaty bots are going to be relevant in any case, then we will have solved the alignment problem. And having solved the alignment problem would probably, like, depending on what precise solution is available, I could certainly see that having a very strong positive influence on our probability of being able to create treaty bots. So conditional on solving the alignment problem to the extent that we don't die, I think the probability of treaty bots being feasible is very high. The question also talks about internal enforcement bots, and that's probably feasible. I think what they're actually guarding about might be MESA optimizers, but they don't use this word, so I'm somewhat undoubted what they, like precisely what scenario they are thinking about. Another thing that could enable really stable institutions is the fact that minds that are digital can be copied exactly. Will this in fact be a feasible idea? That kind of depends. Like in the book Superintelligence, Nick Bostrom outlines the three kinds of superintelligence: quantity superintelligence, speed superintelligence, and quality superintelligence. Where both quantity and speed superintelligence seem like they would enable very stable institutions, whereas quality superintelligence probably don't. But again, it's difficult to see. And some talk about, like, if we in fact end up in this situation and we need to have AI security and military forces, how do we deal with that? And they have some speculations about this, very little, and I think probably if we are in such a poor situation this is required, like we really haven't gotten a proposal act, then probably this will end up being impossible. Okay, let's try to figure out the rights of, if AIs have some kind of moral status, then how do we balance their rights with ours, given the fact that the AIs might have superhuman abilities in some cases, and that would require some kind of adaptation. One of them would be copyability, and humans take quite a long time to reproduce. AIs could reproduce exceedingly rapidly, and it's very clear that trying to make any kind of formal rights for AIs will need to grapple with this very, very early. Then freedom of thought is another right we would really want, except that when I think, like, mind crime seems like an obvious problem for AIs because they are able to instantiate to much greater fidelity. Like, if I think about a person and think about that person's suffering, then the simulation that I have inside my head is of really poor quality, so it doesn't seem like something that, like, there is something really bad happening, because I'm so poor at imagining other people. But an AI might imagine them in perfect quality, and that might make mind crime a real problem. So that requires some very, very strong enforcement powers. And I think the strategic implications of this is, like, I don't think they have been anywhere near completely thought through. A lot of the implications have, like, okay, we have perfect interpretability and something like that, and if we don't have that, then what do we in fact do? I think the implications there are dark and complex and haven't really been explored. The third right they talk about is freedom of speech, and they don't really write more about that. And I think this is another really interesting topic. Like, what do you do if you have an AI that is consistently able to persuade a human of basically anything. How do you coexist with this kind of AI? Obviously, you'd want to restrict this AI from being able to communicate with unprotected humans, because it will be able to convince them of anything. I think it's an interesting problem, and precisely how to deal with that, it hasn't really been explored in this paper. Let's go back to problems of granting the AI's reproductive rights. What if we just do that? In that case, we will see some evolutionary dynamics, and the default outcomes may not be good as they write. And I think that's a real understatement, because we would see AIs copied based purely on their ability to on their reproductive fitness, and that is really, really unlikely to be any kind of thing we want. So saying that it may not be good is really an understatement. So one vote democracy can't really hold, and the social safety net, that seems like something that can't hold. I think there have been quite a few people trying to grapple with these things, and they have found some ways around this. Again, I think a lot of this isn't really that instrumental to us. Some of it might be, but I think like if an AI for non-instrumental reasons or if for instrumental reasons try to create a successor, that successor is then not happy, then sure, it sucks for that being, because we have a highly intelligent, non-happy AI, but it's not necessarily that instrumental until the AI, if it just suffers in silence, even though it's morally very bad. Mind crime. Nick says there's great moral and practical importance of what happens inside computers in an era of digital minds. Like mind crime, the way I typically envision mind crime is that it does in fact have very little practical importance. Can be used perhaps for blackmail, but most likely, like there is a strong general counter to blackmail, which is to self-modify into someone who never gives into blackmail ever, and then you won't be blackmailed. So I don't think this kind of blackmail would necessarily be a big issue. What can we do about mind crime? Well, we could do something akin to child protective services, and that may be like you could have a digital inspector that only returns one bit. Does mind crime happen within this AI? Cybersecurity is another issue, and part of the reason why we want it to only return one bit is that we expect AIs to care very, very strongly about cybersecurity, because the AI probably, in most cases, the most valuable thing the AI has is its own data, its own processes, and this may imply that we could see a single attack getting data from a state in a single act of piracy could transfer basically all the wealth of one state to an attacker, and that would push the incentives strongly towards offense rather than defense. But whether this is actually something that will happen is quite unclear to me. I think there are probably ways around this. It's not clear to me that offense will win out over defense in the age of mind crime. And again, misaligned AI needs to be closely surveyed, and to what extent we have misaligned AIs at this point is something the authors ought to go much more into detail with. If we have solved the alignment problem, we might have really great interoperability tools, and then we can just see is mind crime going on. And the final part of the first part is about getting resources from space, because AIs that enable greater strides in robotics could, obtain great resources from space, and we don't really have a stable framework for doing that. And this would be something that these resources would both have an economic and strategic value, and they're speculating that the thing we could see is misaligned AI trying to expand through the universe to obtain resources to attack rather than immediately attack. I think that's not really obvious, and I also don't think this has many implications, because if the AI wants to do that, then it can do it. So we want to make the AI not want to do that, and that's solving the alignment problem. He also meekly suggests a supplement for the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty is clearly insufficient, but I feel trying to work on that is almost certainly going to be a waste of time, because we are assuming things, so many things, before that's going to be relevant. Like AGI is possible, we'll have a super intelligence, and we'll mostly solve the alignment problem, but we won't actually totally solve the alignment problem. We won't have a strong pivotal leg, but not something really weak, something in between that will allow a multipolar scenario. And this needs to be reasonably stable to allow for this kind of processes that harvest most of the resources in the universe. And then we need to have advantages to grow first rather than attack first, and we need to have someone who's willing to obey the Outer Space Treaty and have the correct incentives to obey this treaty, and only in that case does it make sense to work on making a better Outer Space Treaty. And I think all of this is so incredibly all these assumptions are very unlikely to hold at the same time. So I would strongly expect that it's not worthwhile to improve the Outer Space Treaty. That is all for today. Thank you, and see you next time.